What if the thing you call addiction isn't your weakness, but the place where your soul has been trying to speak to you? Think about it for a moment. Not the obvious addictions, not just substances, but the habits you barely question anymore. The endless scrolling that numbs your evenings. The need for validation that tightens your chest when silence lasts too long. The way you reach for something the moment you feel empty, restless, or unseen. At first, it doesn't look dangerous. It looks harmless, comfortable even, like a quiet ritual you repeat without thinking. Until one day, you realize you're not reaching for pleasure anymore. You're running from a feeling you can't name. Here's the unsettling truth most people never hear. You are not addicted because you want too much. You are addicted because something essential went missing, and the world taught you how to replace it with noise. We live surrounded by stimulation, yet starving for meaning. Every notification promises relief. Every habit whispers, "This will make you feel whole again." But the relief fades faster each time, leaving behind a deeper exhaustion, a heavier silence, a sense that something inside you is slowly dimming. Long before modern psychology tried to fix addiction with control and discipline, one man asked a different question. Not, how do we stop the behavior? But, what is the soul trying to heal? Carl Jung believed addiction was never the true problem. It was a signal, a message from the unconscious, a spiritual thirst disguised as craving. And if that idea feels uncomfortably accurate, if something in you recognizes this pattern, even quietly, it's because this conversation rarely finds people by accident. These are the kinds of ideas that tend to reach those already searching, even if they don't yet have the words for it. This channel exists for minds that sense there's more beneath the surface of human behavior. And if you're drawn to exploring those hidden layers, you're already closer to the work Jung believed could change everything. But before we talk about healing, before we talk about tools or transformation, there's something far more important we need to understand. Because beneath every craving, every compulsion, every escape, there is a specific kind of emptiness. And once you see where that emptiness comes from, you'll never look at addiction the same way again. There's a moment most people recognize, even if they never talk about it out loud. It usually happens in the quiet spaces. Late at night, when the world slows down and distractions lose their grip. Or early in the morning, in that fragile state between sleep and waking, when your guard is down. You start noticing things. A dream that feels too vivid to ignore. Not random images, but symbols that linger all day. Doors you can't open, houses you've never seen, but somehow know. People from your past appearing without warning, carrying emotions you thought were resolved. Then there are the sensations. A tightness in the chest that comes out of nowhere. A sudden fatigue that sleep doesn't fix. A pressure behind the eyes. A heaviness in the body with no medical explanation. And sometimes, it's subtler than that. A persistent feeling that something isn't right. Even when everything looks fine on the surface, you're doing what you're supposed to do. You're functioning. You're surviving. But inside, there's a quiet dissonance, like a note slightly out of tune that never resolves. Most people are taught to dismiss these moments, to label them as stress, overthinking, burnout, or weakness. So they push through, they distract themselves, They stay busy. They reach for comfort. They scroll. They binge. They numb. But what if none of this is random? What if these experiences are not malfunctions, but messages? Carl Jung believed the psyche speaks in a language older than logic, a symbolic language, one that doesn't shout, but repeats itself until it's heard. Dreams, body symptoms, sudden cravings, unexplainable moods. They're not isolated events. They're part of a conversation happening beneath conscious awareness. And when that conversation is ignored for too long, it doesn't disappear. It intensifies. This is where many people find themselves trapped in cycles they don't understand. Why do I keep reaching for the same escape? Why do I sabotage progress right when things improve? Why does relief always feel temporary? The answer isn't a lack of discipline. It's a lack of listening. Because the psyche, when unheard, will find another way to express itself. And often, that expression looks like compulsion. Addiction, from this perspective, isn't a craving for pleasure. It's an attempt to regulate something deeper, a way to quiet an inner signal that's grown too loud to ignore. And the most unsettling part? Many people sense this on some level. They feel that their habits are connected to something emotional, even spiritual, but they don't know how to approach it without fear. So they keep going, living slightly disconnected from themselves, feeling moments of meaning followed by long stretches of numbness, wondering why fulfillment always feels just out of reach. If any of this feels familiar, it's not because something is wrong with you. It's because you're more aware than you've been taught to be. This kind of content tends to resonate with people who are already asking deeper questions, even if they've never said them out loud. And staying close to conversations like this is often how understanding begins to take shape. But here's where things get even more interesting. Because once you realize these signs aren't coincidences, once you accept that something within you has been trying to communicate all along, the real question becomes impossible to avoid. What part of you has been speaking through your cravings, your dreams, and your restlessness? And why did it have to use addiction to get your attention? There is a sign that appears long before addiction becomes visible, long before habits harden, long before cravings take control, and almost no one is taught to recognize it. This first signal is not external. It doesn't arrive as chaos or collapse. It arrives as disconnection, a quiet separation between who you are on the outside and who you feel yourself to be on the inside. Ancient traditions spoke of this long before modern psychology gave it a name. They described it as a loss of alignment, a fracture between the inner life and the outer world, when the soul's direction no longer matches the life being lived. Carl Jung called this state psychic splitting. It happens subtly, usually early, often in moments when being fully yourself carried a cost. Maybe you learned that certain emotions were too much. Anger was unacceptable. Sensitivity was weakness. Curiosity was dangerous. Need was inconvenient. So you adapted. You became who you needed to be to belong, to survive, to be loved. And the parts of you that didn't fit were pushed down. Not destroyed, just hidden. This is where the first secret lives. Because those buried parts don't disappear. They wait. And when they wait too long, they begin to speak in the only language that still gets through. Restlessness, emptiness, craving. Across ancient teachings, this was understood as spiritual thirst, not a desire for pleasure, but a longing for reunion with the self. In alchemy, it was called the nigredo, the dark phase where something essential has been lost and must be recovered. In Eastern traditions, it was described as being cut off from one's true nature. In Jungian psychology, it is the moment the unconscious begins sending signals to restore balance. This is why addiction so often follows people who are intelligent, sensitive, creative, or deeply perceptive. Not because they are weak, but because they feel the disconnection more intensely. Think about it. Addiction rarely starts when life is unbearable. It starts when life becomes empty, but functional. When you're moving, achieving, surviving, but not inhabiting yourself. So the psyche intervenes. It looks for intensity, for relief, for anything that can momentarily simulate wholeness. Substances, screens, validation, relationships, ritualized behaviors. They all do the same thing for a brief moment. They collapse the distance between you and feeling alive. But the relief never lasts. Because it was never meant to. Jung warned that when meaning is lost, the psyche will manufacture substitutes. And the more disconnected you are from your deeper self, the louder the substitutes demand attention. Here's the part that feels almost forbidden to say out loud. Addiction is not evidence of moral failure. It is evidence of a soul that has been unheard for too long. The craving isn't random. It's targeted. It arises precisely where authenticity was once sacrificed. This is why willpower alone never solves the problem. Because willpower addresses behavior, not the fracture beneath it. True healing begins the moment you recognize this first signal for what it is. Not something to suppress, but something to decode. And when people begin to see their patterns this way, something shifts. Shame loosens its grip. Curiosity replaces self-attack. The inner world starts to open again. These are the kinds of insights that quietly change lives. And they tend to resonate most with those who feel drawn to conversations that go beneath the surface. Staying connected to spaces where this deeper language is spoken is often how the remembering begins. But understanding disconnection is only the beginning. Because once you see that something was lost, the next question becomes far more unsettling. What exactly was pushed into the shadows? And how has it been shaping your desires, your fears, and your addictions from behind the scenes? There's a story I want to share with you, not because it's extraordinary, but because it's painfully familiar. It belongs to someone who looked fine on the outside, responsible, intelligent, functioning, the kind of person people trust, depend on, even admire. Every morning followed the same rhythm. Coffee before the world woke up. A schedule filled with obligations. A life that looked stable from a distance. And yet, every night, something surfaced. Not dramatically, not violently. Just a quiet collapse when no one was watching. The scrolling that went on longer than intended. The glass that turned into two. The habit that promised comfort but delivered fog. The strange emptiness that crept in right after. Not guilt exactly, but a dull ache behind the chest. Like grief without a name. What made it worse wasn't the behavior. It was the confusion. "I don't understand why I keep doing this," they said once. "My life isn't bad. So why do I feel like I'm constantly escaping it?" The first real crack came through a dream, a recurring one. They were always standing in front of a locked door, old, wooden, heavy. They could feel something important on the other side, not fear, not danger, but life. And no matter how hard they tried, the key was never in their hands. They woke up every time with the same sensation: a tight throat, a racing heart, and a sadness that didn't belong to the present moment. For months, the dream was ignored, written off as stress, overthinking, nothing more, until the body joined the conversation: fatigue that no amount of rest could touch, a constant pressure in the chest, moments of dissociation like watching life through glass. Doctors found nothing wrong, but something was very wrong. The turning point didn't come through quitting the habit. It came through a single question asked in a moment of brutal honesty. What if this addiction isn't ruining my life? What if it's protecting me from something I was never allowed to feel? That question changed everything. Instead of fighting the behavior, they started listening to it. They traced it backward, to childhood moments of being praised for being easy, for not needing much, for staying quiet, for being strong. They realized how early they learned to abandon their own needs to maintain connection, how creativity was set aside for responsibility, how emotion was swallowed to keep the peace. The locked door in the dream wasn't random. It led to the parts of themselves that had been sealed away, the anger that was never expressed, the grief that was never held, the longing that was never spoken. And the addiction? It was the guard standing in front of that door, not the enemy, the protector. Once this clicked, something softened. The habit didn't disappear overnight, but the shame did. And without shame, curiosity grew. They began journaling conversations with the part of themselves that craved escape. They noticed when the urge appeared, always after moments of self-betrayal, always when authenticity was sacrificed for approval. Slowly, the locked door in the dream began to change. One night, it was unlocked. Another night, it opened just enough for light to spill through. That's the part no one talks about. When you stop seeing addiction as a flaw and start seeing it as a message, it doesn't vanish. It transforms. This is why stories like this matter. Because behind every compulsion is a human being who adapted brilliantly to survive and is now being asked to live. If this story stirred something in you, if you've had dreams, sensations, or patterns that suddenly make more sense, this is exactly the kind of exploration this space was created for. Staying connected to these conversations is how many people begin recognizing their own story in the mirror. And I want to hear yours. Have you ever experienced a dream, a recurring habit, or a physical sensation that later revealed a deeper truth about you? Share it in the comments. I read them, and sometimes they become part of future conversations here. Because the moment you tell the truth about what you're experiencing, you're no longer alone in it. And yet, there's still something deeper beneath all of this. Because once the story behind the addiction is revealed, the real question emerges. If the behavior was never the enemy, what happens when you finally meet the part of yourself it was guarding all along? There is a second spiritual signal that appears after disconnection, and it is far more intimate. This one doesn't arrive through dreams or thoughts. It arrives through the body, a sudden heaviness when you say yes but mean no, a tight chest when you're about to abandon yourself again, a wave of exhaustion after pretending to be fine, a craving that shows up at the exact moment you suppress a truth. Most people think these sensations are inconveniences, stress, anxiety, fatigue, something to push through or numb. But ancient wisdom, and Jung's work with the unconscious, tells a very different story. The body is not reacting randomly. It is remembering. Long before the conscious mind can explain what's wrong, the body signals misalignment. This is the second secret most people never learn. Addiction often begins as a failed attempt to regulate unprocessed emotions stored in the body. Every time you override an inner truth, your nervous system absorbs the cost. Every swallowed emotion leaves an imprint. Every unexpressed boundary tightens the system just a little more. Eventually, the pressure needs release, and the psyche finds the fastest available outlet. This is why urges often feel physical. Restless hands, a buzzing chest, a pull you can't explain. You're not weak for feeling this. You're sensitive. And sensitivity, when misunderstood, becomes suffering. Jung understood that healing doesn't begin with controlling the urge. It begins with interrupting the pattern of unconscious reaction. That's where this technique comes in. It's simple, quiet, and far more powerful than it appears. When a craving or compulsive urge arises, don't fight it. Don't follow it either. Instead, pause and place one hand on your chest or abdomen. Close your eyes. Then ask, not intellectually, but inwardly, what am I feeling right now that I don't want to feel? Don't rush to answer. Just notice. Is it sadness, loneliness, anger, fear of being unseen, the grief of betraying yourself again? Now breathe slowly, deep into the place where the sensation lives. No forcing, no fixing. Stay for 60 seconds. That's it. What you're doing in that moment is revolutionary. You are teaching your nervous system that the feeling itself is survivable, that you don't need to escape it to remain intact. This practice doesn't remove urges instantly. It transforms your relationship to them. Over time, something subtle shifts. The urge becomes a signal instead of a command. The body begins to trust that you are listening, and the intensity softens, not because you suppressed it, but because you met it. This is how meaning replaces compulsion. Not through force, through presence. Anyone can do this. No training, no belief system, just willingness. And for many people, this is the moment where the cycle finally begins to loosen. But here's what almost no one talks about. There is a third signal, one that appears only when you've stopped running, one that doesn't come as discomfort, but as something far more unsettling. Because this signal doesn't ask you to heal a wound. It asks you to become someone you've never been allowed to be. And once you recognize it, your life can never return to the way it was before. If you feel drawn to understanding these deeper patterns and to walking this path with others who sense there's more beneath the surface, this is exactly the kind of work this space exists for. Staying connected to it matters more than most people realize. Because what comes next is not about recovery, it's about transformation. There is a moment on the spiritual path that feels less like healing and more like an undoing. It doesn't arrive as pain. It arrives as clarity, a strange, unsettling clarity. This is the third and deepest signal, the one almost no one talks about, because once you recognize it, you can no longer pretend you don't know. It appears when the addiction begins to loosen its grip, when the body is no longer screaming for relief, when the mind finally grows quiet enough to hear something older, deeper, and far more demanding. This signal is not about what you want to stop doing. It's about who you are being asked to become. Ancient spiritual traditions described this moment with reverence and fear. In esoteric Christianity, it was called death before death, the moment the false self collapses so the true self can emerge. In alchemy, it was the phase after dissolution, when the soul can no longer return to its old form. In Jungian psychology, this was the threshold of individuation. And this is where addiction reveals its final secret. Addiction was never just numbing pain. It was containing power, a force inside you that could not be expressed safely in the life you were living. A truth too large for the mask you were wearing. This is why true healing often brings anxiety instead of comfort at first. Because what's being asked of you now isn't restraint. It's courage. Courage to speak what you've never said. To choose meaning over approval. To live from the center of yourself instead of the edges. This is where many people unconsciously sabotage their own healing. Not because they want to return to addiction, but because stepping into their authentic self would disrupt everything built around suppression. Relationships would change. Identities would dissolve. Old roles would no longer fit. So the psyche hesitates. And this hesitation is often misread as relapse, confusion, or fear of failure. But it's none of those. It's initiation. Physics, in its own language, mirrors this truth. At the quantum level, particles don't change states gradually. They leap. They collapse one form before another can emerge. Human consciousness works the same way. You cannot integrate your true self without dismantling the false structures that kept it hidden. This is why Jung warned that individuation feels like loss before it feels like freedom. Because something must die. Not your habits, not your discipline, but the version of you who learned to survive by disappearing. This is the moment when addiction loses its final purpose. Because once you begin living from alignment, there is nothing left to numb. If this realization resonates, even uncomfortably, it's because you're already standing at this threshold. Content like this is created with devotion, not algorithms, not for trends, but for people who feel this call stirring inside them. And every person who chooses to stay connected here strengthens a quiet community built around depth, not distraction. If this speaks to you, letting this work be seen, even through something as simple as a like, helps keep this space alive. But here's the part that almost no one is prepared for. When you answer this call, when you stop using addiction as a doorway and step fully through it, you don't just heal, you remember. And what you remember changes the direction of your entire life. Because the final stage of this journey is not about becoming better. It's about returning to what you were always meant to be. If you've made it this far, it's not by accident. Something in you recognized this journey long before your mind tried to understand it. Because everything we've explored, the disconnection, the cravings, the body's signals, the shadow, the call to become whole, was never meant to diagnose you. It was meant to remember you. Addiction, seen through this lens, was never a detour. It was a signal flare, a painful, imperfect human attempt to find your way back to yourself in a world that taught you to leave. Every sign you've experienced, the dreams, the restlessness, the cravings, the moments of numbness followed by longing, they were not failures. They were invitations. Invitations to wake up from a life lived on autopilot. Invitations to question the identities you inherited but never chose. Invitations to stop asking, "What's wrong with me?" and start asking, "What truth inside me has been waiting to be lived?" This is the deeper mission behind all spiritual awakening. Not perfection, not purity, but integration. To bring back the parts of yourself you abandoned to survive. To give voice to the emotions you learned to silence. To allow your life to become an expression of meaning instead of an escape from emptiness. And here's the quiet miracle hidden inside all of this. When one person does this work, truly does it, they don't just heal themselves. They change the emotional climate around them. They interrupt generational patterns. They model a different way of being human. This is how consciousness evolves, not through grand declarations, but through individuals who choose awareness over anesthesia, presence over avoidance, truth over comfort. You don't need to have everything figured out. You don't need to be fixed. You don't need to erase your past. You only need to stay honest and stay listening. Because the same force that once expressed itself as addiction can express itself as creativity, purpose, depth, love, and clarity. It was always the same energy. What changes is the direction you allow it to move. If this video touched something real in you, if it gave language to an experience you've never been able to explain, you're already part of this quiet circle of people who sense there is more beneath the surface of life. And this space exists to keep that conversation alive. If you feel called, let yourself be seen for a moment. Leave a comment with your name and the city you're watching from. I read them, and I often share them in future videos as a way of honoring this shared journey. Let this message reach others who might still believe they're broken by gently supporting it. And if you want to continue exploring the deeper layers of the psyche, the soul, and human awakening, staying connected here is one of the simplest ways to do that. Because this was never just a video about addiction. It was a reminder that what you've been searching for in habits, substances, patterns, or escape has been waiting for you on the other side of your own awareness. And once you see that, you don't go back, you go home.